Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Have you ever noticed the moment you finally stop checking your phone, stop replaying the last conversation, stop needing reassurance from him, something shifts? Not outside of you first. Inside. The anxiety quiets down. Your body softens. You sleep through the night for the first time in months. And strangely enough, that's often the exact moment he starts feeling your absence the most. Not when you chased. Not when you explained your worth. Not when you stayed available through every mixed signal. No, it happens when your energy stops reaching for him. And if you've gone through a twin flame separation, you know how painful that moment really is. People romanticize detachment. They never talk about the nights you sit there staring at the ceiling, realizing you're exhausted from loving someone who still cannot meet you emotionally. This video is not about becoming cold. It's not about revenge. It's not about pretending you no longer care. It's about the terrifying, beautiful moment a divine feminine finally remembers. I existed before this connection, and I will still exist without his validation. And once that shift happens, nothing in the connection stays the same. I used to think love meant staying emotionally available no matter how much it hurt. I thought being understanding meant giving endless chances, being patient, being spiritually mature, being the calm one during every withdrawal, every silence, every confusing shift in energy. And for a long time, I wore that exhaustion like proof of love. There is a kind of pain people rarely talk about in twin flame connections. Not the dramatic kind. Not the crying on the floor kind everyone posts about online. I mean the quieter pain. The kind that slowly lives inside your nervous system. The kind where you wake up and the first thing you do is check your phone before your eyes are even fully open. No message. Your stomach drops instantly, and you pretend it doesn't affect you as much as it does. You go to work, reply to people, smile during conversations, but underneath everything your energy is waiting. Waiting for a text, waiting for reassurance, waiting for him to sound emotionally present again, waiting for the version of him you know exists in flashes, but never seems to stay. That kind of waiting changes you. Slowly, quietly. At first, you call it hope, then loyalty, then unconditional love. But eventually, if you're honest enough with yourself, it starts feeling more like survival. And that realization is devastating. Because the divine feminine often doesn't notice how exhausted she is until her body begins reacting before her mind does. The tight chest, the overstimulation, the inability to relax at night, the random waves of sadness that hit while washing dishes or hearing a song or sitting in traffic staring at nothing. You tell yourself you're fine, but your nervous system is telling a different story. I remember sitting on my bed one night, holding my phone in complete silence. No music, no TV, no distractions, just silence. And I noticed something uncomfortable. Every part of me was waiting for him to emotionally return so I could finally feel okay again. That realization shook me, not because I loved him deeply, but because somewhere along the way my inner peace had become dependent on someone else's emotional consistency. And if you've experienced this kind of connection, you know exactly what I mean. You can feel loved by them one week, forgotten the next, then intensely connected again without warning. It creates emotional whiplash. One moment you're convinced the connection is sacred. The next moment, you're lying awake wondering why someone who feels your soul still leaves you emotionally confused. And what makes it harder is that many divine feminines become incredibly skilled at justifying the pain. He's triggered. He's scared. He's awakening. He's processing. He loves me but can't express it. Maybe some of that is true. But there comes a moment where your soul quietly asks a harder question. What about you? What about your exhaustion? Your tears? Your emotional burnout? Your constant overextending? Your loneliness inside the connection itself? People romanticize the feminine's capacity to love deeply. They rarely talk about the cost of loving beyond your emotional limits. And sometimes the deepest form of abandonment is not him leaving. It's you continuously abandoning yourself while trying to keep the connection alive. That's the part nobody prepares you for. The subtle self-erasure. The way you start monitoring his moods more than your own. The way one delayed message can emotionally derail your entire day. The way you become hyper-aware of tiny shifts in tone, energy, eye contact. You notice everything. The shorter replies. The distant energy. The inconsistency. The emotional walls. Your body notices too, even when your mind tries to stay positive. And after enough cycles, something inside the divine feminine begins breaking down emotionally. Not dramatically, quietly. You stop feeling safe. Not physically, energetically, emotionally. You begin living in anticipation instead of presence. And that's when love starts turning into anxiety. I think many people misunderstand what this stage feels like. It's not obsession in the shallow sense. It's deeper than that. It's nervous system attachment. Your body becomes conditioned to emotional unpredictability. The highs feel euphoric. The distance feels unbearable. The reconnection feels relieving. So you keep hoping the next cycle will finally stabilize. But instead, you slowly become tired in places rest cannot fix. And maybe the hardest part, you often hide the exhaustion beautifully. You still post normal photos, still laugh with friends, still try to act grounded, but privately, you're emotionally carrying the relationship almost alone. You become the emotional translator, the initiator, the one holding space, the one trying to understand the silence. And after a while you realize something painful. You haven't truly relaxed in months, maybe years. That realization hit me unexpectedly one afternoon. I was sitting in a cafe pretending to read a book, but I kept rereading the same sentence over and over because my mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept wondering, why hasn't he reached out? Did I say something wrong? Is he pulling away again? Should I give him space? Should I check on him? Should I stay silent? And suddenly, I became aware of how exhausting it was to constantly emotionally orbit another person. I looked around the room. People were talking, laughing, living their lives. And there I was emotionally trapped inside someone else's inconsistency. That moment felt sobering, not dramatic, just deeply sad, because I realized how much life I had missed internally while waiting for emotional certainty from someone who could only offer temporary closeness. And this is where the energy shift quietly begins. Not from anger, not from revenge, not from suddenly not caring. It begins when the feminine becomes too emotionally tired to keep abandoning herself. There is a moment, very subtle at first, where your soul starts craving peace more than emotional intensity. That's new, because for so long intensity felt like love. The late night conversations, the magnetic pull, the deep eye contact, the spiritual synchronicities, the emotional depth. It all felt meaningful. And maybe it was meaningful. But meaningful does not always mean sustainable. That distinction changes everything. I think part of the heartbreak comes from realizing you can deeply love someone and still be emotionally harmed by the dynamic. Those two truths can exist together, and accepting that feels almost impossible at first. especially when the connection feels spiritually significant, especially when your heart keeps remembering the beautiful moments, the softness in his voice, the way he looked at you during vulnerable conversations, the moments he almost opened completely. Almost. That word destroys people in these connections. Almost committed, almost healed, almost emotionally available, almost ready. Meanwhile, your nervous system stays stuck in permanent anticipation, waiting for the almost to become real. But eventually, the body gets tired of waiting for emotional safety that never fully arrives. And when that exhaustion reaches its limit, something inside the divine feminine begins changing. Quietly, not loudly, not all at once. Just a soft inner realization. I can't keep living like this. And strangely enough, that sentence becomes the beginning of her transformation. Not because she stops loving him, but because for the first time, she starts noticing how much she has stopped loving herself inside the waiting. And that realization lingers, long after the silence returns, long after the phone screen goes dark again, long after another night of unanswered emotions. Something inside her has started waking up now, not into detachment yet, not into peace yet, but into awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you finally see your exhaustion clearly, you can never completely unsee it again. Sometimes the divine feminine energy shift does not begin with empowerment. It begins with exhaustion, with realizing your body has been carrying emotional stress your soul can no longer justify. And the moment you stop romanticizing your suffering, the healing quietly begins. There's a very specific silence that appears the day you stop texting first. Not the kind of silence outside of you, the kind inside your body. A strange stillness, like something that had been running for months suddenly stops moving, and now you can finally hear how exhausted you really are. At first, it doesn't feel empowering. That's the part nobody tells you. People online love talking about detachment as if it's some glowing spiritual breakthrough. As if the divine feminine wakes up one morning completely healed, serene, unbothered. But the real moment, it's messier than that. Much quieter. Usually, it starts with emotional exhaustion finally outweighing hope. You wake up one morning and realize you cannot keep being the one holding the emotional connection together. So instead of reaching out, you do nothing. And that nothing feels terrifying. I remember the first time I consciously decided not to text him. My hand physically twitched toward my phone several times that day. I wish I were exaggerating. I would open the app, close it, reopen it, stare at his name, then lock my screen again. The silence felt unnatural, not peaceful, withdrawal-like. And that's when I understood something uncomfortable. I had become emotionally conditioned to reaching for him. Not always because I wanted conversation. Sometimes I just wanted relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from emotional distance. Relief from the feeling that the connection was slipping away again. So when I stopped reaching, my nervous system panicked before my soul relaxed. That's important to understand. Many divine feminines think the anxiety means they're making the wrong decision. It doesn't. Sometimes anxiety is simply what happens when you stop feeding an emotional pattern your body became dependent on. And the first few days after pulling your energy back can feel incredibly disorienting. You start questioning yourself constantly. Am I being cold? Am I abandoning the connection? What if he thinks I stopped caring? What if this silence pushes him away forever? Meanwhile, a quieter voice inside you whispers something else. What if I've been abandoning myself this whole time? That question changes everything. Because for so long, your attention has been directed outward, toward him, toward his emotions, his wounds, his fears, his inconsistencies, his readiness. Now suddenly, there's nowhere for your emotional energy to go except back toward yourself. And honestly, that can feel deeply uncomfortable at first. You begin noticing how much of your day revolved around him energetically. The urge to check if he viewed your story, the instinct to reread old messages, the habit of interpreting songs, signs, synchronicities, the mental rehearsing of future conversations that may never happen. It becomes painfully obvious how emotionally occupied you've been. Not just emotionally connected, occupied, consumed quietly. And one of the hardest moments during this phase is nighttime. Daytime distractions help a little. Work, conversations, errands, noise. But nighttime exposes everything. You lie there in silence with your thoughts, and suddenly the absence feels enormous. Your body notices the missing attachment before your mind fully understands what's happening. The chest tightness, the urge to reach out just one more time, the irrational fear that if you stop pursuing the connection, it will disappear forever. And maybe you've experienced this too. You pick up your phone at 1:17 a.m., type a message, delete it, type another one, delete that too. Then you just stare at the screen, not knowing whether you miss him or miss the temporary emotional relief his attention used to give you. That distinction matters more than people realize, because sometimes the feminine is not addicted to the person. She's addicted to the intermittent emotional reassurance, the brief closeness after distance, the warmth after withdrawal, the emotional intensity after silence. It becomes a cycle, and when you interrupt that cycle by no longer reaching, your entire inner world reacts. I remember going grocery shopping during this phase and realizing I couldn't focus on anything properly. I kept checking my phone between aisles. No message. Again, that sinking feeling returned instantly. And then another realization hit me. I had attached my emotional stability to his responsiveness. Not intentionally, not consciously, but gradually. That's what these connections do sometimes, especially when there's inconsistency mixed with emotional depth. Your body starts living in anticipation, waiting for emotional confirmation that you still matter. And the strange thing is, the moment you stop chasing that confirmation, you often feel grief before freedom. Real grief, not symbolic grief. The grief of letting go of the version of yourself who kept hoping this time would finally be different. The grief of accepting that love cannot survive on potential alone. The grief of no longer wanting to beg for emotional consistency from someone you deeply care about. That grief is sacred, even though it hurts. Especially because nobody around you fully understands it. From the outside, people may think, why don't you just move on? But they don't understand the emotional complexity of these bonds. They don't understand what it feels like when someone touches your soul deeply yet still cannot fully stay present emotionally. That contradiction confuses the heart. And confusion keeps people emotionally attached far longer than clarity does. I think that's why this chapter of the journey feels so lonely. You're grieving someone who is still alive, still connected to you energetically, still appearing in your thoughts, maybe even still communicating occasionally. But internally, something is ending. Not necessarily the connection itself, but the version of you that constantly reaches for love while abandoning her own emotional well-being. And that ending hurts a lot. There's also another uncomfortable truth people rarely admit. When you stop reaching, you begin discovering how much effort was actually coming from you. That realization can feel heartbreaking. The conversations become quieter. The energy shifts. The emotional momentum slows. And suddenly you're forced to confront a painful possibility. Was I carrying this connection emotionally more than I realized? That question can trigger waves of sadness. Not anger. Sadness. Because you remember all the times you justified the imbalance. All the times you accepted inconsistency in the name of understanding. All the times you minimized your own emotional needs to protect the connection. And now, without constant effort holding everything together, the truth becomes harder to avoid. I went through a period where every instinct in me wanted to break the silence. Not because I had something important to say. I just missed feeling emotionally connected. That's the honest part people skip. Sometimes you don't miss the person as much as you miss the feeling of emotional closeness. The dopamine, the anticipation, the hope. And withdrawing from hope can feel brutal, especially when your heart still loves them. That's what creates the emotional contradiction of this phase. You can miss him deeply and still know you need distance. You can love someone and still recognize the dynamic is hurting you. You can want reunion and simultaneously feel exhausted by the emotional instability. Those contradictions make the divine feminine journey incredibly human. Not perfect, not spiritually polished. Human, and somewhere inside this silence, something subtle begins happening. Your awareness starts returning. Tiny pieces at first. You notice moments where you aren't thinking about him constantly anymore. Moments where your body relaxes unexpectedly. Moments where laughter feels natural again. Small moments, but important ones. Because healing rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly, in fragments, in tiny nervous system exhalations, in moments where your mind finally stops scanning for emotional danger. And even though the silence still hurts, you begin sensing something unfamiliar underneath the grief. Space. Space to feel yourself again. Space to hear your own emotions clearly. Space to remember the parts of you that existed before the waiting consumed everything. That's when the energy shift truly starts. Not when you become emotionally numb. Not when you stop loving him. But when your inner world no longer revolves entirely around whether he chooses you consistently. And ironically, that's often the exact moment he begins feeling the energetic difference most intensely. But that part comes later. First, the feminine must survive the silence she once feared. She must sit inside the emptiness long enough to realize it isn't actually empty. It's her own soul waiting to return. Pulling your energy back is not punishment. It's the painful beginning of emotional honesty. And before detachment ever feels peaceful, it often feels like grief, withdrawal, confusion, and silence. But hidden inside that silence, your relationship with yourself begins rebuilding for the first time in a very long while. I didn't realize how much of my energy was constantly reaching for him until I stopped. Not in a dramatic way. Not with a decision written in stone. Just a quiet withdrawal, like my soul slowly unclenching its grip. At first, nothing happens. That's the strange part. You expect fireworks, a reaction, a message, some kind of proof that the connection is real even without your ever holding it together. But instead, silence. And that silence feels different from the one before. Because this time, you are not chasing it. You are inside it. I remember waking up on the third morning after I stopped reaching. My first instinct was still the same, check my phone. But something felt slightly off. Not painful, just unfamiliar. Like a routine I had repeated so many times it no longer belonged to me. No message, no notification. But instead of the usual emotional collapse, there was a gap. A tiny gap between stimulus and reaction. And in that gap, I felt something subtle shift. Not him, me. And that is where most people miss what is actually happening. Because the divine feminine energy shift does not begin with external validation. It begins with internal interruption. The pattern breaks first inside your nervous system long before anything changes outside. And in that space, something unexpected starts unfolding. He feels it, not consciously, not logically, but energetically. It is not immediate clarity for him. It is confusion, a subtle emotional mismatch he cannot yet name. I've seen this described in many ways online, but the truth feels more human than mystical. It looks like this. He opens your chat, pauses, then doesn't type. He thinks about you at random moments during the day. He feels a strange emptiness he cannot explain. He remembers you without a specific trigger. Or he dreams of you in fragmented ways. Not always romantic, sometimes unsettling, sometimes emotionally intense. Not because you are doing anything, but because your emotional presence in his field has changed. And change always registers before understanding. I want to be careful here, because this is not about control. It is not about manipulating someone's feelings. It is something far more subtle and uncomfortable to admit. When you stop overgiving emotionally, the energetic dynamic between two people reorganizes itself naturally, without permission, without announcement. And if you've ever been in a twin flame separation, you know exactly how strange this stage feels. Because you are still emotionally connected, but the rhythm is broken. There is no longer a constant emotional bridge being built from your side. And for someone who unconsciously relied on that bridge, the absence is noticeable, even if they do not understand why. I remember sitting in a cafe during this phase, staring out the window, noticing how quiet my mind had become. Not peaceful yet, just quieter. And in that quietness, I realized something important. I was no longer mentally rehearsing conversations with him, no longer analyzing every micro shift in tone, no longer decoding silence, no longer trying to predict emotional outcomes. It was like stepping out of a constant internal negotiation. And in that same moment, I felt something strange. A sudden emotional flicker, a memory of him, not triggered by anything external, just appearing. And that's when it hit me. If I can feel him when I am detaching, maybe he can feel me when I am no longer reaching. Not as certainty, not as fact, but as energetic symmetry. Because these connections are not one-directional emotional habits. They are relational systems. And when one side stops feeding the dynamic in the same way, the system destabilizes. At first, that destabilization often shows up in subtle ways. You don't hear from him immediately. Instead, you feel a strange emptiness where emotional predictability used to be. And on his side, he begins sensing unpredictability in you, even if you haven't changed your outer behavior dramatically. The real shift is internal. You are no longer emotionally available in the same automatic way. You are no longer responding from urgency, no longer reaching from fear of loss, no longer reinforcing the cycle. And the nervous system notices that first. On both sides, I used to think his silence meant nothing was changing. But later I realized silence is often where the shift becomes most active. Because nothing external distracts from the internal recalibration. There is a strange paradox here. When you are actively reaching, the connection feels alive but unstable. When you stop reaching, the connection feels quiet, but something underneath it starts moving. And that movement is what most people misinterpret. Because suddenly he may appear in unexpected ways. A message after days of silence. A random reaction to your presence. A sudden curiosity. a shift in tone, or sometimes just emotional distance that feels different from before. Not rejection, not intimacy, but awareness. Like something inside him has noticed a gap, a missing frequency. And this is where confusion often begins for both sides. For you, it can feel like hope returning. For him, it can feel like emotional disorientation, because he is no longer receiving the same energetic accessibility he unconsciously relied on. And the human mind does not immediately interpret energetic change correctly. It translates it into emotion, into curiosity, into discomfort, into longing, into avoidance, rarely clarity. I remember during this phase feeling torn between two realities. One part of me felt strangely empowered, like I was finally reclaiming my own emotional space. But another part of me still wanted to reach out, still wanted to check if everything was okay, still wanted to restore the old pattern because it was familiar. That internal contradiction is one of the most human parts of this journey, because detachment is not clean. It is not linear. It is not a single decision. It is a series of emotional withdrawals layered with longing mixed with clarity interrupted by memory. And in the middle of all that, something deeper begins forming. Self-awareness. I started noticing something small but significant. When I didn't reach out, I didn't fall apart the way I expected. The world didn't collapse. The connection didn't immediately disappear. I was still here, breathing, functioning, feeling moments of calm in between waves. And that realization was destabilizing in a different way, because it challenged the belief that my emotional stability depended on him. And if that belief was not entirely true, then what else wasn't? That's where the shift becomes irreversible, not because the connection changes externally, but because your perception of dependency begins dissolving. Meanwhile, on the other side of the connection, something else is unfolding, not always dramatic, sometimes very subtle. A pause before sleeping, a sudden thought of you during silence, a moment of emotional discomfort without clear cause, a memory resurfacing without context, and instead of resolution, there is curiosity. Why am I thinking about her now? And the mind, lacking a logical explanation, begins reaching, not toward certainty, but toward meaning. And meaning is where emotional awareness begins to stir. But here is the part many misunderstand. This does not automatically mean reunion. It means awareness of absence. There is a difference, because awareness does not equal readiness. He may feel something shifting without knowing what to do with it, and you may feel the same shift without knowing whether to trust it or protect yourself from it. That tension creates emotional space between you, a space that did not exist when you were constantly reaching. And space changes perception. I noticed this when I look at old messages during this phase. They felt different, not less meaningful, but less urgent. Like I was no longer inside them emotionally, more like observing them from a distance I didn't know I had gained. And that distance is what allows truth to surface slowly, without emotional distortion, without immediate reaction, just awareness. And awareness, once again, changes everything, because it reveals something simple but powerful. You were not only connected to him, you were also deeply connected to the version of yourself who kept trying to maintain emotional closeness at any cost. And when that version begins stepping back, the entire relational dynamic shifts, quietly, unpredictably, humanly. And even though nothing has resolved yet, you begin sensing a new kind of tension in the air. Not anxiety exactly, not peace either. Something in between. Like the connection is no longer static. Like something is waking up inside the silence itself. And you can feel it, even if you cannot name it yet. When you stop reaching, nothing immediately fixes itself. But something far more important begins to change. The emotional system between two people stops running on autopilot. And in that pause, both hearts begin noticing absence for the first time in a different way. I wish someone had warned me how quickly silence can turn into hope again. How easily your nervous system can confuse attention with healing. And how one small shift from him can pull you right back into everything you were just starting to leave behind. It usually doesn't arrive as a grand return. No dramatic confession. No full emotional awakening. No clear apology that explains everything you went through. It's something much more subtle, almost disappointing in its simplicity. A message. A reaction to something you posted. A hey that feels slightly warmer than before. A sudden check-in after days of distance. And your entire body reacts before your mind can catch up. I remember this moment clearly. My phone lit up. His name. Nothing extraordinary. Just a simple message. But my nervous system responded like something inside me had been switched back on. Heart rate change. Heat in the chest. Instant alertness. A strange mix of relief and tension at the same time. And in that moment, everything I had been building in silence suddenly felt fragile. Because here's the truth nobody prepares you for. You don't only miss the person. You miss the emotional regulation they temporarily provided. And when they return, even slightly, your body remembers the relief faster than your mind remembers the pain. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Longer than necessary. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I could feel something dangerous happening internally. Hope. Not the grounded kind. The emotional kind. The kind that starts rewriting the past in real time. Suddenly, the distance doesn't feel as heavy anymore. The confusion feels fixable. The silence feels like it meant something. The inconsistency becomes a phase. And this is where the trap begins. Because nothing has actually changed yet. But your perception already has. I replied. A simple message. Neutral. Careful. Controlled. But inside, I was no longer neutral. I was re-entering. And I knew it. What makes this stage so confusing is that his return doesn't feel fake. It feels real enough to pull you back emotionally. Warm enough to soften your boundaries. Familiar enough to calm your fears. Uncertain enough to keep you guessing. And that combination is powerful. Because it does not demand full surrender. It only asks for a small opening. And once you open that door even slightly, the all dynamic can begin rebuilding itself almost immediately. I noticed how quickly my mind started adapting again. Maybe he's changing. Maybe he needed space. Maybe this is the turning point. It happens almost automatically. Like the emotional system is desperate to restore meaning to the connection. Because uncertainty is harder to hold than hope. But there is something I learned in that moment that I could not unsee afterward. Temporary attention feels like emotional proof, but it is not emotional transformation. And the body rarely distinguishes between the two at first. He doesn't suddenly become someone new just because he reached out. But your nervous system begins behaving as if something fundamental has changed. You start monitoring tone again, interpreting every word again, feeling the emotional highs return again. And slowly, the silence you survived starts getting rewritten. Not truthfully, but emotionally. I remember catching myself smiling at my phone at random moments during the day. Not because something meaningful was happening, but because the possibility of reconnection had re-entered my emotional field. And that possibility is intoxicating because it brings back the version of the connection you kept holding onto during separation. The version where everything felt aligned, where the intensity felt sacred, where the connection felt like destiny instead of confusion. And that version is powerful enough to override recent pain. That is the danger. Not that he returns, but that your emotional memory reactivates faster than your emotional wisdom. There is a moment in this stage where you begin adjusting yourself again. Without realizing it at first, you reply a little faster. You soften your tone. You become slightly more available emotionally. You start re-engaging the dynamic in subtle ways. Not because you decided to go backward, but because your body remembers how to survive inside the connection. And survival patterns are deeply embedded. One night, I found myself rereading our messages again, something I had stopped doing during separation. And I noticed something disturbing. My mind was not evaluating reality. It was selectively highlighting emotional moments that supported hope. A memory of him being soft, a moment of vulnerability, a sentence that could be interpreted as emotional depth. The mind becomes very creative during this phase. It reconstructs meaning. It edits out inconsistency. It magnifies emotional peaks. It downplays emotional absence, not intentionally, but instinctively, because hope is easier to hold than loss. And this is where the divine feminine often gets caught again, not because she is unaware, but because she is emotionally re-engaged before she is consciously aware of it. I remember thinking, maybe this is the shift everyone talks about. But deep down, something quieter was present, as subtle unease. Because even though he had returned in some form, there was no real conversation about what had broken before. No emotional accountability. No clear acknowledgement of the distance. No grounded explanation of change. Just re-entry. And re-entry without clarity is not resolution. It is reactivation. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because attention can mimic transformation without ever becoming it. And the body, once again, begins adjusting to a familiar rhythm. The waiting, the interpreting, the emotional scanning, and just like that, you are no longer fully in separation. But you are not in stability either. You are in between. And that in-between state is where most emotional confusion lives. I remember one afternoon sitting quietly and realizing something painful. I was no longer in silence, but I was still not at peace. And that's when I understood the trap more clearly. Winning him back emotionally, even partially, does not automatically mean healing has occurred. Sometimes it simply means the cycle has restarted, just in a softer form. One of the most difficult questions I had to ask myself during this stage was this: am I responding to him from clarity or from withdrawal relief? Because those two emotional states feel very different underneath everything else. Clarity feels grounded. Withdrawal relief feels urgent. Clarity does not rush. Withdrawal relief tries to stabilize quickly. And I could feel the difference in my own body. The urge to reconnect too quickly. The subtle fear of losing momentum. The desire to not mess this up this time. That fear is very human. Because when someone returns after distance, the mind wants to secure the connection immediately, before it disappears again. But that urgency is not love. It is emotional insecurity trying to prevent another loss. And if you are not careful, you start rebuilding the exact dynamic that created the separation in the first place. Softly, gradually, without noticing, I began noticing small things I had overlooked before. How I was the one adapting emotionally again. How I was the one interpreting uncertainty again. how I was the one holding emotional continuity again. And I remember sitting with that realization quietly. No anger, just clarity slowly forming. Because this time, I could see the pattern more clearly. The connection had not transformed yet. Only my access to him had temporarily changed. And access is not the same as alignment. That realization created a strange emotional split inside me. One part still hoped, still wanted to believe this was the turning point. But another part was beginning to see the structure beneath the feeling. And that structure was familiar, too familiar. And yet, letting go of the hope that things were finally changing felt like grief again. Because hope is not just about the future. It is about emotional survival in the present. And releasing it means sitting with everything you were avoiding feeling before. The loneliness, the uncertainty, the lack of closure. All of it returns at once. And that is why this stage is so dangerous. Because the return of hope can feel like healing, when in reality, it is often just the reopening of emotional dependency. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it again, even while you are still in it, even while part of you still wants it to work. There is a moment in this chapter where everything feels suspended, not moving forward, not fully collapsing, just hovering. And in that suspension, your emotional truth starts becoming louder than your emotional desire. And that is where the real shift begins to form again. Quietly, behind hope, behind fear, behind everything you are still trying to figure out. Attention is not transformation. When he returns, it can feel like healing has begun. But sometimes it is only the emotional cycle restarting in a softer disguise. And the real test of the divine feminine is not whether she is chosen again, but whether she can recognize the difference between being re-engaged and truly being met. I didn't notice the exact moment it happened. There was no announcement inside me, no emotional breakthrough, just a quiet morning where I realized I wasn't reaching for my phone the same way anymore. At first, I thought something was wrong, because peace didn't feel like peace. It felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, like my body was waiting for the next emotional spike, but it never came. And instead of chaos, there was just stillness, real stillness, the kind that doesn't demand attention, the kind that doesn't need interpretation, the kind that simply exists without asking anything from you. I remember sitting at the edge of my bed one morning, holding my phone in my hand, and for a few seconds, I didn't immediately open anything. No reflex, no urgency, no emotional scan, just pause. That pause felt strange. Because for so long, my mornings had been built around anticipation. Before my feet even touched the floor, my mind was already checking. Did he text? Did he view anything? Did something change overnight? Is there emotional movement again? It wasn't even conscious anymore. It was automatic, a nervous system habit. And suddenly, the habit broke for a moment. Not completely, but enough for me to notice. And in that noticing, something shifted. I didn't feel the same panic when I saw no message. I didn't feel the same collapse in my chest. It was still there faintly, but it no longer controlled my entire emotional state. And that realization was subtle but powerful, because I had been living for so long in emotional hypervigilance that I forgot what neutrality felt like. Not happiness, not excitement, neutrality. And neutrality, after emotional intensity, feels almost like emptiness at first. I went to the kitchen that morning and made coffee slowly. No phone in my hand, no background checking, just silence. And I noticed something else. My breathing felt different, less shallow, less tense. like my body wasn't bracing for emotional impact anymore. And that's when I understood something I hadn't been able to see before. My nervous system had been living in constant anticipation of emotional change. Not just about him, but around him. And when that anticipation stopped being constantly triggered, my body didn't know how to interpret it immediately. It took time, days, maybe weeks, but slowly, something began to reorganize inside me. I started noticing small changes first, very small. I could sit through a full conversation without mentally checking my phone. I could watch a movie without thinking about him in the background. I could walk outside and actually notice the weather, the sounds, the people passing by. These things sound ordinary, but when you've been emotionally occupied for a long time, ordinary becomes healing. I remember one afternoon walking alone through the city. The sun was soft. People were sitting in cafes, laughing, talking, existing in their own timelines. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't emotionally inside another person's unpredictability. I was just here, present, and something inside me whispered, "This is what it feels like to not be emotionally pulled." It didn't feel like joy yet, but it felt lighter, and that lightness was unfamiliar enough to feel almost uncomfortable, because part of me still expected something to disrupt it. A message, a shift, a sudden emotional return. But nothing came, and the absence of that something slowly began to feel less threatening. I started noticing how differently I responded to triggers. For example, I would see his name pop into my mind and not immediately spiral into interpretation. I would feel a memory and not automatically attach meaning to it. I would think of him and then continue what I was doing. That might sound small, but in this kind of emotional journey, it is everything. Because the real shift is not when you stop loving someone. It is when your thoughts about them stop controlling your internal state. There was still emotional residue. Of course, you don't just erase connection like that. Some nights I still felt waves of missing him, but the waves no longer pulled me under completely. They passed, and I stayed. That was new. And strangely, that stability started changing how I saw everything, including him. Because when your nervous system is no longer in survival mode, your perception becomes clearer. I remember reading old messages during this phase, but something was different this time. I wasn't emotionally inside them anymore. I was observing them, not analyzing, just noticing. And I could see patterns I couldn't see before. The inconsistency, the emotional ambiguity, the moments where I had filled in gaps with hope, the times I had overinterpreted minimal effort as deep meaning. Not from blame, just awareness. And awareness can feel heartbreaking, but also freeing, because it removes illusion. And without illusion, you begin to see the connection more honestly. One evening, I sat by the window for a long time without doing anything. No music, no phone, no distraction, just the sound of life outside. And I realized something unexpected. I wasn't actively missing him in that moment. Not because I stopped caring, but because my emotional energy was no longer constantly directed outward. It had started returning inward, slowly, naturally, like water finding its own level again. And in that return, there was space. Space I didn't know I had lost. Space to feel myself again without interruption. Space to think without emotional noise in the background. Space to exist without constantly referencing someone else's emotional state. And that space felt fragile at first, almost to quiet. But over time, quiet stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like stability. I noticed I was sleeping differently. Not dramatically better, but less restless. Less waking up in emotional confusion. Less dreaming that left me shaken. My body was recalibrating, slowly aligning with a different emotional baseline, one that wasn't constantly reactive. And this is the part many people don't talk about. The nervous system does not choose peace instantly. It chooses familiarity first. And emotional chaos, when repeated long enough, becomes familiar. So when peace arrives, the body initially resists it, not because peace is unsafe, but because it is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels like uncertainty. But if you stay long enough in that unfamiliarity, something changes. The body begins to learn a new pattern, a quieter one, a slower one, a less reactive one. And eventually, peace stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like home. I remember the first moment I realized I hadn't checked his status in hours, and it didn't feel like an effort. It just didn't occur to me. And when I noticed that, I paused. Not because I was trying to analyze it, but because I felt a small shift of disbelief. Like, wait, I didn't think about him constantly today. And instead of panic, there was calm. A calm I hadn't fully trusted yet. Because after emotional intensity, calm can feel unstable at first. Like something is missing. But nothing was missing. Something was returning. Me. Not the version of me that was always reaching. Not the version of me that was always interpreting silence. Not the version of me that was always emotionally bracing. But the version that simply existed without constant emotional negotiation. And in that return, something very subtle began to happen. I started valuing peace more than intensity. And that shift is not small. Because intensity had once felt like connection. If it wasn't intense, it didn't feel real. If it wasn't confusing, it didn't feel deep. If it wasn't emotionally charged, it didn't feel meaningful. But now, I was starting to see something different. That real connection does not require emotional instability to exist. And that realization changed everything underneath the surface. Even if nothing external had fully changed yet. Healing does not always feel like clarity or joy at first. Sometimes it feels like unfamiliar silence. But when your nervous system slowly stops living in emotional anticipation, you begin to realize that peace was never emptiness. It was simply the space where you finally get to come back to yourself. I didn't change myself to be seen. I stopped reaching, and somehow, that was the moment I started being seen differently. It didn't happen in a dramatic way. There was no sudden confession, no emotional breakdown on his side, no clear moment where everything became obvious. It was subtler than that, almost uncomfortable, and how ordinary it looked on the surface. A pause before replying, a slightly different tone. A message that arrived later than usual but carried more attention than before. A question that felt like it had weight behind it, even if it was simple. And if you've been through this kind of connection, you know how quickly your mind wants to interpret it, to assign meaning, to build hope, to reconnect the story again. But something inside me was different this time. Not cold, not detached, just more aware. I remember reading one of his messages and noticing something strange. I wasn't immediately emotionally pulled into it. There was a gap between reading and reacting. A small one, but noticeable. And in that gap, I could feel my own presence again. Not his energy, mine. And that changed the way I experienced everything. Because when you are constantly reaching, you are not fully present in yourself. Your attention is partially out of your body, always scanning the other person. But when you stop reaching, something shifts in perception. And that shift is often mirrored back to you. Not instantly, not clearly, But subtly, I started noticing that he was engaging differently. Not dramatically more, but differently. More curiosity, more attention in certain moments, less emotional distance in specific interactions. And yet, what stood out the most was not his behavior. It was my internal response to it. Because I wasn't reacting the same way anymore. I wasn't overanalyzing every shift. I wasn't trying to decode emotional intention. I wasn't mentally holding the connection together anymore. And somehow, that changed the dynamic more than anything I had ever done before. There is something uncomfortable about this realization, because it forces you to question everything you believed about effort and love. For a long time, I thought emotional closeness was something I had to maintain, something I had to hold, something I had to protect, something I had to keep alive through understanding, patience, and constant emotional availability. But what I didn't realize was this: over-efforting creates imbalance, not intimacy. And imbalance eventually becomes emotionally visible even if no one names it directly. I remember sitting in a cafe one afternoon, watching people pass by outside the window. My phone was on the table, silent, no urgency and need to check anything. And in that stillness, I realized something important. I was no longer emotionally chasing him, not because I stopped caring, but because my emotional energy was no longer dependent on his response patterns. And in that absence of chasing, something unexpected began to happen. He started leaning in differently, not aggressively, not suddenly, but in small ways. A longer message than usual, a moment of vulnerability he didn't fully explain, a curiosity about my life that felt more intentional than before. And yet, what I noticed most was not the behavior itself. It was the shift in emotional tone behind it. It no longer felt like I was talking to someone emotionally far away. There was a slight closeness in the way he engaged. Not full presence, but proximity. And that word matters, because proximity is not the same as connection. It is the feeling of being closer without being fully met. And this stage is where many divine feminines begin to feel confused again, because the absence of chasing can sometimes create the illusion of progress. But what is actually happening is more nuanced. You are no longer overgiving, so the emotional field becomes less saturated. And in that space, the other person can begin to notice you differently, not because you are doing more, but because you are doing less from a place of need. I remember one night, I reread our recent conversations, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The emotional tone had shifted slightly, not in words alone, but in pacing, in presence, in engagement. But even more importantly, I had shifted. I was no longer responding from urgency, no longer reacting from fear of losing the connection, no longer trying to stabilize emotional uncertainty through communication. And because of that, I wasn't reinforcing the same dynamic anymore. That realization felt both empowering and disorienting, because part of me still wanted certainty, still wanted clarity, still wanted emotional reassurance that this shift meant something permanent. But another part of me was beginning to see something deeper. Change in this dynamic does not always mean resolution. Sometimes it simply means recalibration. And recalibration is not always comfortable. I started noticing how differently I experienced silence now. Before, silence felt heavy. Now, silence felt neutral. Not always peaceful, but no longer threatening. And that alone changed how I showed up. Because when silence stops triggering panic, you stop overcompensating in communication. And when you stop overcompensating, The other person no longer receives the same emotional cushioning they were used to. And that absence is felt. Not immediately understood, but felt. I remember a moment where he asked me something simple. "How have you been lately?" But the way he asked felt different. Less casual. More attentive. Like there was an awareness behind the question that wasn't there before. And instead of rushing into emotional sharing like I used to, I paused. I answered honestly, but calmly, without emotional overextension. And I noticed something in that exchange. A slight shift in how he responded back. Not withdrawal, not distance, but reflection. As if something in the interaction had changed shape. And I realized something subtle but powerful. When you no longer overextend emotionally, the other person has to meet you where you actually are instead of where your effort used to carry the connection. That realization is not romantic. It is grounding, because it removes fantasy from perception. I also began noticing something internally that I didn't expect. I wasn't as emotionally invested in decoding him anymore. I still cared, but I wasn't emotionally entangled in interpretation. And that created a new kind of clarity. A clarity that didn't depend on his behavior being consistent. It depended on my internal state, becoming steady enough to observe without distortion. And from that place, everything looked different. Not better, not worse, just clearer. And clarity is not always comfortable. Because clarity removes emotional cushioning. It shows you dynamics as they are, not as you hope they are. There were moments where I still felt pulled into old patterns. Moments where I almost reached out first. Moments where I almost re-entered the emotional cycle. Moments where I questioned whether I was doing this right. But those moments no longer controlled my behavior. They passed, like waves that rise, but no longer pull you under. And in those pauses, I started noticing something quietly profound. My presence was no longer disappearing when he became inconsistent. I stayed, not emotionally reactive, not emotionally absent, just present. And that presence began changing how I was perceived in the connection, not because I became more powerful, but because I stopped abandoning myself in real time. And that is what changes everything. I want to be honest here. This stage is often misunderstood. People think it means he is coming back, or he is finally realizing your worth. But the deeper truth is more complex. What is actually happening is a shift in relational structure. When one person stops over-functioning emotionally, the entire dynamic adjusts. And that adjustment can feel like increased attention from the other side. But attention is not always emotional alignment. Sometimes it is simply awareness of change. And awareness does not guarantee depth. That is where discernment becomes important. Because it is easy to confuse being noticed with being truly met. I had to sit with that distinction quietly, not rushing to conclusions, not attaching meaning too quickly, just observing what was real in front of me. And in that observation, I realized something that stayed with me deeply. I was no longer trying to become someone he could finally love properly. I was becoming someone who could no longer abandon herself for the sake of being loved at all. And that shift is irreversible, even if the connection continues, even if it shifts again, even if nothing fully resolves. Something inside me had already changed direction, and I could feel it, quietly, consistently, without needing confirmation. When you stop overreaching emotionally, people often begin to see you differently, not because you become more desirable, but because you become more present. And presence changes everything, even when nothing is said out loud. I used to imagine his awakening would feel beautiful. Like one day he would finally understand everything, finally open emotionally, finally speak the words I had been waiting to hear. I thought it would feel relieving. I didn't expect it to feel heartbreaking. One of the hardest truths in twin flame separation is realizing that awakening does not always arrive in time to protect the connection from damage. Sometimes people wake up emotionally after they feel your absence deeply enough. And by then, something inside you has already changed. Not your love, your capacity to survive emotional inconsistency. I remember the first moment I sensed something was different in him. It wasn't dramatic. Actually, it was almost invisible. A softness in his voice that wasn't there before. A hesitation before ending conversations. A strange emotional attentiveness that felt unfamiliar. Like someone trying to reach for something they didn't fully know how to hold yet. And instead of feeling victorious, I felt sad. Deeply sad. Because I could suddenly see the grief underneath his behavior. Not just mine. His too. People often talk about the divine masculine as if he is emotionally unaffected during separation. Cold, detached, avoidant, unaware. But I don't think that's fully true. I think many of them feel everything, just much later. And by the time those emotions finally surface, the feminine has already bled internally for so long that she is no longer standing in the same emotional place. That timing difference creates enormous pain, because now both people feel the connection deeply, but not at the same moment. And emotional timing matters more than love alone. That realization shattered something naive inside me, because for so long I believed, if he truly feels this connection, eventually love will naturally fix everything. But love does not automatically heal emotional avoidance. Love does not automatically create emotional maturity. Love does not automatically repair inconsistency. Love does not automatically teach someone how to stay. And seeing that clearly hurts, especially when you can feel the sincerity underneath their confusion. I remember one conversation during this phase that stayed with me for a long time. There was a pause between us. A long one. Not awkward. Heavy. Like both of us were standing emotionally at the edge of something neither of us fully knew how to name. And I noticed something in his eyes. Regret. Not performative regret. Not manipulative regret. The kind that sits quietly inside someone when they finally begin understanding the emotional consequences of their own avoidance. And strangely, that hurt more than the distance ever did. Because now I could feel that he wasn't emotionally absent in the way I once thought. He had been emotionally overwhelmed, emotionally fragmented, emotionally unequipped. That does not excuse the pain, but it changes the shape of it. And one of the hardest emotional contradictions in this chapter is this. You begin understanding him more deeply. At the exact moment you are no longer capable of abandoning yourself to save the connection. That contradiction is brutal, because compassion returns. You start seeing the fear underneath his inconsistency, the shame underneath his withdrawal, the confusion underneath the silence. And suddenly, your anger softens, but your boundaries remain. That combination feels emotionally confusing at first, because many divine feminines secretly believe boundaries require emotional detachment. They don't. You can understand someone completely and still recognize they are hurting you. You can love someone deeply and still stop waiting for them. You can feel compassion without re-entering self-abandonment. That is maturity. But maturity often feels heartbreaking before it feels empowering. I remember sitting alone one evening after one of our conversations. The room was quiet. My phone was face down beside me, and I felt this overwhelming wave of sadness wash over me. Not because I thought he didn't care anymore. Oddly enough, it was because I realized he probably did care. In his own way. Maybe more than I had allowed myself to believe before. And yet, that realization didn't magically create safety. It didn't erase inconsistency. It didn't undo emotional damage. It didn't suddenly make the connection stable. That's the painful part people rarely talk about. Sometimes love exists, and the relationship still struggles to survive. That truth is difficult for the heart to accept, especially when the connection feels spiritually significant. Because the feminine often waits for the masculine's awakening as if it will resolve everything emotionally. But awakening is messy. Messier than people admit online. It doesn't instantly transform someone into a fully emotionally available partner. Sometimes awakening first looks like grief, confusion, regret, emotional disorientation. Sometimes it looks like someone realizing what they lost only after the emotional distance becomes irreversible. And when that realization hits them, it can destabilize them deeply. I noticed this subtle sadness in him during this phase. Not dramatic sadness. Quieter. Like someone emotionally replaying moments privately. Moments they dismissed too quickly. Moments they avoided vulnerability. Moments they assumed there would always be more time. There is a particular pain that comes from realizing someone loved you imperfectly, not maliciously. Because anger is easier to process than emotional tragedy. And some twin flame separations feel deeply tragic. Not toxic in the obvious sense. Tragic to people feeling enormous depth, while lacking the emotional synchronization necessary to sustain it. I remember looking at him once during this phase and thinking, "You finally see me now. But I needed you to see me when I was drowning beside you emotionally." That thought stayed with me for weeks, because it captured the grief of delayed awakening perfectly. And maybe some viewers listening to this know exactly what that feels like. Watching someone slowly become emotionally aware, while simultaneously grieving the version of yourself who begged for that awareness months or years earlier. There's no clean emotional category for that experience. It's not resentment exactly. It's mourning. Mourning the timing. Mourning the emotional distance. Mourning all the moments where love existed, but could not fully land properly between two wounded nervous systems. And I think the divine masculine feels that grief to once awakening begins. Not always consciously, but internally, through restlessness, regret, sudden emotional memories, unexpected longing. Because once the feminine stops overfunctioning emotionally, the masculine is finally left alone with the emotional reality he used to avoid through distance. That is often where awakening truly starts. Not through spiritual concepts, through emotional absence, through realizing someone who once emotionally carried the connection is no longer doing it the same way. And suddenly, the silence feels different to him too. Not peaceful, consequential. I think many people imagine awakening as a romantic climax, but often it feels more like emotional exposure. The walls no longer protect the person hiding behind them. And when that happens, all the unprocessed emotions begin surfacing at once. Fear, love, regret, longing, shame, especially shame. Because deep down, many emotionally avoidant people know when they have hurt someone who genuinely loved them. They know, even if they could not face it at the time. And once awareness arrives, that knowledge becomes difficult to escape internally. I remember hearing something in his voice during this phase that I had never heard before. Not confidence, not certainty, tenderness, fragile tenderness. Like someone trying to touch a connection carefully after realizing how easily it could disappear. And instead of giving me complete relief, it made me emotional. because I realized how much pain existed underneath both sides of this journey. Not villains and victims, just two people carrying different emotional survival patterns, trying, failing, missing each other emotionally in real time. And maybe that is what makes these connections so difficult to let go of completely. Not perfection. Humanity. The raw humanity of watching someone awaken emotionally while knowing love alone may still not be enough to repair everything that happened between you. That realization matures the feminine deeply, because now she is no longer seeing the masculine through fantasy alone. She is seeing him clearly. His wounds, his fear, his delayed emotional processing, his humanity, and clarity changes love. It makes it quieter, less obsessive, less idealized, but strangely, more real. And yet, there is still one terrifying question lingering underneath all of this. What happens when two people finally understand the connection deeply, after the damage has already changed them both? That question sits heavily between them now, unanswered, breathing quietly beneath every interaction, and neither of them fully knows yet where it will lead. Awakening is not always beautiful when it first arrives. Sometimes it comes carrying grief, regret, and the painful realization of what emotional avoidance has cost both people. And one of the hardest parts of the divine feminine journey is learning that you can deeply understand someone's wounds without sacrificing yourself to heal them anymore. For a long time, I confused emotional pain with spiritual depth. If it hurt deeply, I assumed it meant the connection was profound. If it consumed me emotionally, I assumed it was sacred. If I couldn't let go, I assumed it must be destiny. That realization is difficult to admit out loud, especially in twin flame dynamics where intensity is often treated like proof. Proof of soul recognition, proof of spiritual connection, proof that the love is somehow bigger than ordinary relationships. But eventually, something inside the divine feminine begins questioning a painful possibility. What if some of the suffering I called sacred was actually emotional instability I learned to normalize? That question changes everything, because once you ask it honestly, you start seeing the connection through a different lens. Not colder, clearer. I remember sitting alone one night after another emotionally confusing interaction with him. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was the strange part. No fight, no breakup, no betrayal. Just inconsistency again. Warmth followed by distance. Connection followed by silence. Emotional openness followed by retreat. The familiar cycle. And I remember staring at the ceiling thinking, why does love always feel like emotional recovery after emotional injury? That thought hit me harder than I expected, because I suddenly realized how much of the relationship had revolved around surviving emotional fluctuations instead of actually experiencing peace together. And survival is not intimacy. It just feels intense enough to resemble it sometimes. That distinction is painful, especially when the connection genuinely contains real love, because now you're forced to separate two things that once felt inseparable: depth and suffering. I think many divine feminines unconsciously become addicted to emotional intensity, not because they enjoy pain, but because intensity creates emotional immersion. It consumes the mind, occupies the body, makes everything feel meaningful. The longing feels meaningful. The waiting feels meaningful. The aching feels meaningful. And after enough time inside that emotional atmosphere, peace starts feeling unfamiliar, even boring. That's one of the hardest truths to admit. Sometimes chaos feels more emotionally convincing than stability. Not healthier, just more stimulating. I remember going through a phase where silence without emotional tension felt empty to me. If there wasn't emotional urgency, I assumed the connection was fading. If there wasn't longing, I assumed the love was weakening. If there wasn't pain, part of me wondered whether the connection was even real anymore. That mindset quietly reshapes the nervous system. You begin associating emotional suffering with emotional importance. And once that association forms, you tolerate things you should not have to tolerate in love. Emotional inconsistency, mixed signals, unclear intentions, long silences without accountability. You endure them not because they feel good, but because you've attached spiritual meaning to entrance itself. And eventually, that becomes dangerous, because the line between unconditional love and self-abandonment becomes blurry. I remember one conversation with a friend during this phase. She asked me something simple. When do you actually feel calm in this connection? I paused, longer than I expected, and I realized most of my good moments were actually moments of temporary relief after emotional uncertainty, not consistent safety. Relief. That realization felt sobering, because relief and peace are not the same thing. Relief is the nervous system relaxing after stress. Peace is the nervous system not living in constant stress to begin with. And I had spent so long cycling between anxiety and relief that I mistook the relief for emotional fulfillment. That's what emotionally intense connections can do. They train the body to crave resolution instead of stability. And once you see that pattern, you cannot fully unsee it again. I started noticing how often I romanticized emotionally painful moments simply because they felt profound. The late-night emotional conversations, the tears, the longing, the almost losing each other moments. Everything felt cinematic, spiritually charged, but quietly underneath all of it, my nervous system was exhausted. And eventually, exhaustion begins telling the truth fantasy tries to hide. I remember sitting in my car one afternoon after hearing from him unexpectedly. Months earlier, that moment would have emotionally consumed my entire day. But this time, I noticed something strange. The emotional high faded quickly, not because I stopped caring, but because my body no longer wanted intensity more than peace. That shift felt deeply unfamiliar, and honestly, a little sad, because part of me realized I was grieving the fantasy version of love I had clung to for so long. The fantasy where emotional chaos meant soul-level connection. The fantasy where suffering guaranteed spiritual significance. The fantasy where waiting endlessly proved devotion. But mature love does not require emotional destruction to feel real. And that realization can feel almost disappointing at first, especially if you spent years associating passion with emotional instability. I think many people secretly fear calm relationships because calm forces you to confront yourself without distraction. No emotional roller coaster, no constant anticipation, no dramatic reunion cycles, just presence, consistency, honesty. And for someone conditioned to intensity, that can initially feel emotionally flat. But over time, I began noticing something beautiful about peace. It allowed me to hear myself again. Not my anxiety, not my longing, not my projections. Myself. I could think clearly, sleep more deeply, feel emotions without drowning inside them. And slowly, I began understanding something I wish more people talked about. A connection can be spiritually meaningful and still emotionally unhealthy in its current form. Those two truths can coexist. That realization removes shame from the journey because it allows you to stop forcing yourself to romanticize suffering just to preserve the meaning of the connection. You no longer need pain to validate the depth of what you experienced. And once that happens, your standards change. Quietly, naturally, You begin craving emotional honesty more than emotional intensity, consistency more than mystery, presence more than potential. And suddenly, things that once impressed you emotionally no longer feel enough. A late-night vulnerable message no longer erases months of inconsistency. Chemistry no longer outweighs emotional safety. Spiritual language no longer replaces accountability. You start seeing relationships through the lens of nervous system health instead of emotional intoxication. And that changes everything. I remember noticing this during a conversation with him. There was warmth between us. Real warmth. But for the first time, I wasn't emotionally disappearing into it. I was present enough to notice both the connection and the instability underneath it. That dual awareness is part of maturation. Before, I only focused on the emotional depth. Now, I could also see the emotional consequences. And strangely, that made the connection feel more human, less idealized, more honest. Because real love is not measured only by emotional intensity. It is also measured by emotional responsibility, the ability to stay, to communicate, to repair, to create safety instead of confusion. And once the feminine begins understanding this, her entire relationship with suffering changes. She no longer glorifies emotional pain as proof of devotion. She no longer believes endurance automatically equals spiritual evolution. She starts asking different questions. Not, how intense is this connection? But, how does this connection affect my nervous system? That question is life-changing because it brings the body back into the conversation. Not just the fantasy, not just the longing, not just the spiritual narrative. The body, the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the emotional hypervigilance, the exhaustion, all the things she used to minimize in the name of love. And now, she can no longer ignore them, not because she has become cynical, but because she has become honest. There is a quiet maturity that forms here, a softer kind of wisdom. The realization that love should not require you to constantly recover from it emotionally. And perhaps the most powerful shift of all is this. Peace stops feeling boring. It starts feeling safe. Safe to breathe. Safe to rest. Safe to remain connected to yourself while loving another person. That kind of love may not feel emotionally explosive at first, but it does something intensity never could. It allows the soul to soften instead of survive. And once the feminine experiences the difference internally, she cannot fully return to romanticizing suffering the same way again. Even if part of her still misses the intensity sometimes. Even if part of her still loves him deeply. Something inside her has evolved now. Quietly, irreversibly. And from this place, an even deeper transformation begins. Not round the connection, round her identity itself. Not every emotionally painful connection is meant to be romanticized forever. Sometimes the greatest spiritual lesson is realizing that suffering and depth are not the same thing. And when the divine feminine stops confusing emotional chaos with sacred love, she finally begins choosing peace without feeling guilty for it. I didn't find my power by making him finally choose me. I found it the moment I realized how often I had stopped choosing myself. That realization did not arrive dramatically. No cinematic breakthrough. No perfectly healed version of me standing in the mirror suddenly transformed. It came quietly, through ordinary moments. Moments so small I almost miss them. Like laughing at something genuinely funny and realizing I hadn't thought about him for an entire hour. Or walking through a store and noticing music playing overhead instead of replaying old conversations in my mind. Or sitting alone at night without needing emotional reassurance to feel okay. Tiny moments. But together, they form something much bigger. The return of myself. I think one of the hardest parts of the twin flame journey is how subtly you can disappear inside it. Not physically, energetically, emotionally. Your attention slowly moves away from your own life and toward the connection itself, toward the waiting, the signs, the emotional shifts, the hope, the fear, and eventually, you stop realizing how little of your inner world actually belongs to you anymore. I remember one afternoon standing in front of my closet trying to decide what to wear before meeting friends. And suddenly I noticed something strange. I was choosing clothes based on how I wanted to feel, not based on whether someone else might notice me. That sounds so simple. But after years of emotionally orienting myself around another person's energy, that moment felt profound. Because it reminded me, I still existed outside the connection, not as someone waiting to be chosen, as a full human being. And that rediscovery feels emotional in ways people rarely talk about. Not exciting at first. Tender. Like reconnecting with a version of yourself you accidentally abandoned while trying to hold onto love. I started noticing how disconnected I had become from my own desires. Not big life goals necessarily. Small things. What food I actually liked. What music made me feel calm. What places made me feel peaceful. What kind of mornings made my body relax. For so long, my emotional world had revolved around reacting to distance, reacting to inconsistency, reacting to hope. And now suddenly, there was space to ask, what do I feel when I'm not emotionally consumed by someone else? That question changed my relationship with myself completely. I began doing things slowly again. Not performative healing. Real healing. The kind nobody claps for online. Going on walks without needing distraction. Cooking meals properly instead of eating emotionally. Cleaning my room and realizing how chaotic my environment had become during emotional overwhelm. Calling people back. Laughing naturally again. Life started feeling less emotionally compressed. More breathable. And the strange part, the connection didn't disappear. That's important. Many people think returning to yourself means you stop loving the person entirely. That wasn't my experience. I still loved him. Still thought about him sometimes. Still felt emotional waves occasionally. But he was no longer the center of my inner universe. That position was slowly returning to me. And that shift changes the feminine deeply. Because once your emotional energy starts returning inward, you begin seeing how much of your life had been suspended emotionally. Dreams delayed. Creativity abandoned. Friendships neglected. Body ignored. Joy postponed. All because part of you believed, I'll fully live once this connection stabilizes. That belief is heartbreaking. Because it places your life on hold emotionally while waiting for someone else to become ready. And many divine feminines stay in that waiting space for years without realizing it. I remember sitting at a cafe one morning watching people walk past the window. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't analyzing the connection. I wasn't trying to figure out the journey. I was just present. Watching sunlight move across tables, listening to cups clink softly in the background, feeling my body relax into the moment. And suddenly, I started crying quietly, not from sadness, from recognition, because I realized how long it had been since I truly felt connected to my own life without emotional noise covering everything. That moment stayed with me deeply. It felt like meeting myself again after years of emotional absence. And maybe some people listening to this understand exactly what I mean. That strange grief of realizing I disappeared inside loving someone. Not intentionally, not weakly, gradually, one compromise at a time, one justification at a time, one emotionally exhausting cycle at a time, until eventually, you no longer recognize your own emotional baseline. But once you begin returning to yourself, something unexpected happens. Your standards change naturally, not from ego, not from bitterness, from self-respect. You stop craving emotional intensity the same way. You stop glorifying inconsistency. You stop feeling impressed by temporary attention, not because your heart closes, because your nervous system remembers what peace feels like now. And once the body experiences emotional safety again, chaos loses some of its seductive power. I remember one evening receiving a message from him that would have emotionally consumed me months earlier. And this time, I read it calmly, not coldly, just calmly. I noticed the emotional warmth in it. I noticed the familiarity. I noticed the lingering connection. But I also noticed myself. My breathing stayed steady. My mind stayed clear. My emotional center remained intact. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. I no longer needed the interaction to emotionally validate my existence. That changes everything. Because now love is no longer functioning as emotional survival. It becomes choice. And love chosen consciously feels very different from love driven by fear of abandonment. I also began noticing something else during this stage. My creativity started returning. Not just artistic creativity, life creativity, ideas, motivation, curiosity. I wanted to rearrange my space, try new things, reconnect with forgotten parts of myself. It was as if all the energy once trapped inside emotional fixation was finally being released back into my own life. And honestly, that felt emotional too, because it revealed how much life force I had unknowingly poured into waiting. Waiting for texts, waiting for clarity, waiting for emotional consistency, waiting for timing to align. Meanwhile, my own soul had been waiting for me. That realization is both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because you finally reconnect with yourself. Painful because you realize how long you abandoned that relationship internally. I think one of the deepest transformations in the divine feminine journey happens when the central question changes. At first, the question is, will he choose me? Later, it becomes, why did I keep choosing emotional suffering over myself? And eventually, the question becomes even quieter. Can I remain connected to myself even while loving someone deeply? That question marks true evolution. Because now the journey is no longer about controlling the outcome of the connection. It becomes about integrity with yourself. And integrity changes the feminine completely. She stops betraying her own intuition to preserve fantasy. Stops ignoring her emotional needs to maintain closeness. Stops minimizing her exhaustion to keep hope alive. Not angrily, lovingly. There is a softness that develops here. A grounded kind of feminine energy that no longer needs to prove devotion through suffering. And strangely, that softness feels more powerful than all the emotional intensity that came before it. I remember looking at myself in the mirror one night during this phase. Nothing externally dramatic had changed. Same face, same room, same life. But internally, I felt different, calmer, more present, less fragmented. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt emotionally loyal to myself. That sentence alone nearly broke me emotionally, because I realized how long I had spent being emotionally loyal to the connection, while quietly abandoning my own well-being. And now, something had reversed. Not my love for him, my relationship with myself. And once that relationship begins healing, everything else starts looking different too. Even the connection, even the pain, even the future. Because now the feminine is no longer trying to become worthy of love. She is remembering she was worthy before the connection ever began. And from that realization, a final transformation quietly approaches. One even deeper than healing. Freedom. The divine feminine does not truly heal by finally being chosen. She heals by returning to herself after years of emotional self-abandonment. And when her energy finally comes home to her own soul, love stops feeling like survival and starts feeling like a choice. The strangest part of this journey was realizing I could still love him deeply without needing him to complete my life. I never thought those two things could exist together. For so long, love and longing felt inseparable to me. If I loved deeply, I suffered deeply. If I cared deeply, I feared losing. If the connection mattered, my emotional state depended on it. But somewhere along this journey, that started changing. Not suddenly, not perfectly, just quietly, like the ocean becoming calm after years of storms. I remember the exact moment I realized something fundamental inside me had shifted. I was sitting alone one evening. No music, no distractions, just soft light coming through the window as the day faded. And naturally, he crossed my mind. But this time, my body didn't tighten. There was no panic, no emotional urgency, no instinct to reach for my phone, no desperate need to know where we stood. Just love, quiet love, the kind that exists without demanding immediate reassurance. And honestly, that moment felt more powerful than any emotional high I had ever experienced in the connection. Because for the first time, my love was no longer attached to emotional survival. It was free. That word matters. Free. Not detached in a cold way. Not numb. Not pretending not to care. Free from dependency. Free from emotional self-abandonment. Free from needing another person's consistency to feel whole. And once you experience that kind of inner freedom, you begin understanding the journey differently. You realize the twin flame path was never only about reunion. It was about awakening yourself out of emotional fragmentation, out of fear, out of survival patterns, out of confusing longing with identity. I think many divine feminines secretly believe that healing means they will eventually stop loving the person entirely. But that's not always true. Sometimes healing looks like this instead. You still love them, but your life no longer collapses around their absence. That distinction changes everything. Because now love is no longer controlling your nervous system. It is simply part of your heart's experience. I remember seeing something online during this phase that said, if it's truly a soul connection, you'll never stop loving them. And strangely, that idea no longer scared me. Months earlier, it would have devastated me emotionally. But now, it felt peaceful. Because I finally understood something important. Love does not become dangerous until you abandon yourself inside it. And I wasn't abandoning myself anymore. That's the shift. Not the disappearance of feeling. The disappearance of emotional dependency. I started noticing how differently I moved through life now. I could enjoy beautiful moments without wishing he were there to validate them. I could feel sadness without spiraling into hopelessness. I could miss him and still sleep peacefully afterward. That emotional stability felt sacred in a way intensity never did. Because peace asks nothing from you except presence. No chasing. No decoding. No emotional bargaining. Just life unfolding naturally again. And somewhere inside that peace, I stopped obsessing over the future of the connection. That happened gradually too. At first, every spiritual sign felt urgent. Every interaction felt loaded with meaning. Every silence felt like a test. But now, life felt less like a puzzle I needed to solve emotionally. I no longer woke up asking, "Will he come back?" Instead, quieter questions appeared. How do I want to feel today? What kind of life feels emotionally safe to me? What relationships nourish my nervous system instead of exhausting it? Those questions grounded me back into reality, back into embodiment, back into my own life. And maybe that's the final lesson hidden underneath the entire twin flame journey. You cannot fully receive love while emotionally abandoning yourself to keep it. That truth changes the feminine completely, because now she no longer needs to force outcomes, no longer needs to overfunction emotionally, no longer needs to convince someone to choose her properly. She understands something deeper now. What is meant for her will require presence, not self-erasure. I remember having a conversation with him during this stage that felt strangely calm, not emotionally explosive, not painfully intense, just honest. And I noticed something surprising afterward. I didn't replay the conversation obsessively in my head. I didn't analyze every sentence afterward. I didn't emotionally unravel trying to interpret hidden meanings. I simply experienced the interaction and stayed connected to myself afterward. That was new. And in many ways, that felt like the true reunion. Not necessarily reunion with him, reunion with myself. Because for years, I had experienced connection at the cost of self-connection. Now finally, both could exist at the same time. That balance changes everything, especially the fear. The fear of losing him begins dissolving quietly when you realize you are no longer losing yourself. And once that fear weakens, love becomes softer, cleaner, less desperate. You stop needing constant proof. Stop demanding certainty from the future. Stop measuring your worth through someone else's readiness. And ironically, that is often when the feminine becomes most magnetic energetically, not because she is trying to attract, but because she is finally emotionally whole within herself. There is a groundedness in that energy people can feel immediately. A calm presence, a lack of emotional grasping, a quiet self-respect, and the masculine often feels that shift deeply because the emotional dynamic is no longer being driven by fear. It is being held by awareness. But by this point in the journey, something even more important has happened. The feminine no longer needs the outcome to feel complete. That sentence would have terrified me earlier in the journey, because I thought not needing him meant losing the connection emotionally. But it didn't. It actually allowed me to experience the connection more honestly than ever before, without fantasy, without desperation, without emotional addiction covering everything. Just truth. And truth feels quieter than obsession, but infinitely more peaceful. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about divine feminine energy is that people associate it with attracting someone back. But true feminine embodiment is not about attraction. It's about self-return. Returning to your body, your intuition, your peace, your integrity, your life. And once that return happens, the entire connection changes meaning, whether reunion happens or not. Because now your soul is no longer trapped inside waiting. It is living again, fully. I remember walking outside one evening during this phase. The air felt cool. The city was quiet. People passed by without knowing the emotional journey I had survived internally. And suddenly, I felt overwhelming gratitude, not for the pain itself, but for who I had become because I finally stopped abandoning myself inside love. That realization brought tears to my eyes instantly, because I understood something I couldn't understand earlier in the journey. The connection did not come into my life to destroy me. It came to reveal where I was disconnected from myself. And once I healed that disconnection, everything changed, even love itself. Now, do I still believe some soul connections are real? Yes, absolutely. But I no longer believe real love requires endless suffering to prove itself. I no longer believe longing is the highest form of devotion. I no longer believe emotional instability is spiritual depth. I no longer believe waiting endlessly is proof of unconditional love. Real love, the kind that nourishes instead of consumes, allows you to remain connected to yourself while loving another person deeply. And perhaps that is the final divine feminine shift. Not becoming cold, not becoming detached from love, but becoming emotionally free enough to love without losing yourself again. So, if you are in separation right now, if you are grieving, waiting, awakening, ask yourself gently, what if this journey was never only about him? What if your soul did not come here merely to experience intense love, but to finally remember your own worth outside of who chooses you? Sit with that question, quietly, because somewhere inside it, your entire life may begin changing. And if this message found you at the exact moment you needed it, let me know in the comments. At what point did you realize you were finally returning to yourself during this journey? I would truly love to hear your story. The final divine feminine shift is not about making someone love you correctly. It is about becoming emotionally whole, whether they do or not. And the moment you stop needing external validation to feel complete, love stops feeling like survival and finally becomes freedom.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.